Welcome to the debate. The European Union has really embarked on a mission to secure its digital financial landscape, fundamentally restructuring oversight. They've moved decisively away from fragmented national directives toward a single, harmonized, regulation-centric rulebook. Think DORA for operational resilience, AMLR for anti-money laundering, MiCA for crypto assets, and the Payment Services Regulation, or PSR.
And that strategic pivot toward harmonization is absolutely critical. I mean, moving key conduct rules into binding regulations, immediately applicable across all member states, is essential for eliminating the fragmentation and, the regulatory arbitrage that criminals previously exploited. It's about building a common financial battlefield where the rules are consistent for everyone.
Precisely. The ambition is clear: eliminating loopholes and securing the financial system. But this transformation, while sure, theoretically sound, has dramatically shifted the operational landscape. And that brings us to our central question today. Has the EU's new comprehensive regulatory architecture, in its zealous pursuit of systemic security and a single rulebook, inadvertently created a disproportionate compliance burden that stifles innovation among fintech challengers, thereby favoring the well-resourced incumbent institutions?
Well, I believe that perceived burden is simply the necessary and frankly long overdue cost of ensuring systemic stability and consumer protection. These new regulations are correcting a historical regulatory arbitrage where challengers externalized risks that banks have always had to internalize under prudential rules like Basel III.
And I will argue that the sheer cost and complexity of integrating this new compliance stack fundamentally disfavor those disruptive new entrants, especially the crypto asset service providers, the CASPs, who really rely on speed and low overhead. It creates a regulatory moat. While I fully concede the theoretical benefits of harmonization, the framework's practical implementation is, I think, inherently biased toward incumbents that already possess mature compliance and governance structures. To really understand the overhead, you have to look at what I'm calling the multi-layered compliance stack now imposed on new entrants.
What do you mean by that stack specifically?
So take a brand new entity, a CSP, for instance, offering exchange and custody services. To operate, it must simultaneously get a license under MiCA, comply with the full stringent AML-CFTR rulebook, which now deems it an obliged entity, and implement the entire DORA operational resilience framework. It's not just one regulation, it's a total integration of 4 major rule sets, all convergent on day one. This multi-layered requirement forces them to divert massive seed capital and development resources to regulatory overhead, drastically slowing down that innovation cycle and increasing the barrier to entry.
I see why you think that, but let me offer a different perspective. These firms are now handling critical financial functions, holding consumer assets, managing high-risk transactions. They are, for all intents and purposes, acting as financial institutions regardless of their branding. The European Banking Authority's guidance on the stablecoin conundrum, where they analyze the overlap between MiCA and the payment rules, it explicitly confirmed the same risk, same rule doctrine.
That doctrine is the foundation, yes.
And it insisted that core safety pillars like strong customer authentication, SCA, and cumulative capital requirements must be met even during transition periods. The technology you use is irrelevant. The underlying risk, be it operational failure, fraud, or money laundering, that dictates the rule. The EU is simply closing loopholes that allowed fintechs to externalize massive risk onto society and the traditional banking sector.
But let's move beyond the licensing principle for a second and look at the sheer complexity of the operational implementation. DORA's operational rigor is the real challenge for small firms. You mentioned resilience testing. DORA mandates periodic threat-led penetration testing, or TLPT.
Right, which is essentially advanced scenario-based red teaming. It's mandated to test resilience against severe targeted attacks.
Exactly. And when you combine that with strict incident reporting timelines, requiring an initial report within, 4 to 24 hours of a major incident, this transforms a small firm's technical team, which should be coding and innovating, into a high liability compliance center. These specific requirements are incredibly resource-intensive and expensive to implement correctly, giving banks who have been doing this for decades a massive competitive advantage.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the operational rigor is disproportionate. That requirement is intrinsically linked to the Basel III framework for traditional finance. Let me be clear about the mechanism here. When a high-risk firm, like a volatile CASP or a fast-growing PSP with unproven controls, partners with a traditional bank, that bank has to assign a higher operational risk RWA, risk-weighted asset, to that relationship.
Which means what, practically?
It means RWA is the amount of regulatory capital a bank must set aside to absorb potential losses. So if a bank partners with an entity that has poor IT security or unreliable governance, that operational risk is considered higher. The bank then must tie up more cash, more precious capital, against that partnership, which makes that fintech partner just too expensive to deal with. DORA forces fintechs to prove they are low op-risk partners with robust controls, and that directly lowers the RWA impact on the entire system. It's a crucial measure for systemic stability.
That's a sophisticated defense of the stability objective, but it places the entire cost of lowering that RWA onto the challenger. Let's pivot to the customer interface, specifically the liability shifts under the Payment Services Regulation package, because this fundamentally complicates innovation in e-commerce and payments.
We're talking about the tension between user conversion and fraud protection.
Precisely. The core business tension for merchants, especially high-volume iGaming operators who are now AML-obliged entities, is optimizing conversion by requesting strong customer authentication exemptions at checkout. They rely on methods like transaction risk analysis, or TRA, to justify less friction.
Sure, they're trying to speed up the checkout process, reduce cart abandonment. It's understandable.
But requesting that exemption immediately shifts the fraud liability away from the card issuer and onto the acquirer or the merchant itself. This immediate penalty, being forced to bear the cost of any fraud for seeking friction reduction, forces many firms to adopt a highly conservative, friction-heavy payment flow simply to minimize liability risk. It structurally penalizes the kind of dynamic payment innovation the EU claims to champion, and it effectively favors traditional conservative card network security models.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The PSR's new rules on fraud are necessary precisely because the old rules were inadequate against sophisticated threats like authorized push payment fraud, and, specifically, the mechanism of spoofing. The shift to making PSPs liable for APP fraud losses in cases of spoofing is not a punishment for innovation. It is a crucial consumer protection measure that forces the entire ecosystem to invest in better security technology, which benefits everyone.
It forces massive capital consumption to cover that new liability, which, again, incumbents can handle much better than small, agile PSPs.
But look at the balance the PSR package creates. It also mandates significant improvements to open banking. It requires incumbent banks, the PSPs, to invest and improve the quality and functionality of their open banking APIs. Poor bank API quality was a massive friction point and a bottleneck under PSD2. So the regulation targets bank reluctance just as much as fintech risk, aiming for a system where high security standards are non-negotiable for all players. And, moving back to operational stability, there's a massive strategic victory in this new architecture that benefits all firms regardless of size. DORA's groundbreaking provision to directly supervise critical third-party providers, or CTPPs.
The cloud firms and major IT providers, right?
Exactly. Before DORA, the entire EU financial sector was critically reliant on a small handful of non-financial, non-EU tech firms. This created an unacceptable concentration risk. If one major cloud provider failed, the entire financial system could grind to a halt. This expansion of regulatory power allows the European supervisory authorities to conduct on-site inspections and impose penalties directly on those tech giants. It fundamentally safeguards the underlying infrastructure for all financial entities, including small fintechs and CASPs who rely entirely on that infrastructure. It de-risks the foundation they build upon.
I concede that addressing concentration risk is essential. However, I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because the legal and practical accountability remains solely with the financial entity. The source material confirms the FE is fully and solely accountable for its own compliance, even when critical functions are outsourced. So while the ESAs can theoretically supervise CTPPs, the DORA burden, including mandatory exit strategy requirements and strict contractual provisions, falls entirely on the PSP or the CSP.
But the regulation gives the financial entity leverage over the CTPP by making the CTPP subject to regulatory review.
Only in theory. In practice, this forces smaller firms to hire significant legal and compliance teams just to manage big tech suppliers, to negotiate these complex contracts that include termination rights and mandated disaster recovery provisions. This is a cost incumbent banks just absorb easily, but it structurally cripples smaller innovators. They are forced to micromanage their biggest suppliers, a regulatory overhead completely disproportionate to their size. Furthermore, we see the EU creating what really amounts to gold plating on top of global standards, creating an unnecessary barrier specifically for the crypto sector. Specifically, the Transfer of Funds Regulation, the TFR, which implements the global FATF standards, explicitly rejected the FATF's suggested de minimis threshold of €1,000 for the travel rule.
Meaning the collection and transfer of originator and beneficiary information has to happen for virtually every single transaction.
Correct. It applies to crypto transfers from the very first cent. That means the TFR imposes a significant constant compliance and technology burden on every CASP, even for microtransactions like buying a coffee with crypto or transferring a tiny amount of stablecoin. This creates a requirement far stricter than global peers, and one that disproportionately impacts low-value, high-volume services that depend on rapid, low-cost processing. It just slows down crypto adoption.
That's a compelling argument regarding the operational friction, but have you considered that the high-risk nature of crypto assets warrants this stringency? The TFR's no de minimis rule is a direct countermeasure against smurfing. You know, the breaking up of large illicit transfers into smaller ones, or just fast-moving financial crime. If you allow even a small threshold, illicit actors immediately pivot to high-frequency, low-value transactions to fly below the radar.
But there's a technological overhead associated with tracking the travel rule on every single cent. It's an enormous data challenge.
Perhaps, but the goal here is to create a true fortress against financial crime. We have to remember that the AMLRA now explicitly includes high-risk sectors like online gambling operators as obliged entities. When you link high-risk transactions from crypto to high-risk sectors like gambling, closing every loophole, including low-value anonymity, becomes a non-negotiable step toward achieving a truly secure single rulebook. The stability of the entire digital market is paramount.
So my conclusion is that the focus on convergence and resilience, while undoubtedly essential for stability, has placed too great a structural overhead on the agents of innovation. The integrated framework of DORA, AMLR, and PSR. It creates a regulatory moat. It ensures that while the financial system is technically safer, the battlefield is heavily tilted toward the large, established players. This effectively slows down the very fintech maturation and disruption that the EU claims to champion. The cost of entry is now prohibitive for true disruptive newcomers.
I would just reframe that. The new rulebook is not anti-innovation, it is pro-maturity and pro-stability. The cost of compliance is simply the necessary investment in becoming a credible, stable entity in this global financial battlefield. By forcing all participants, from incumbent banks to CASPs, to adhere to the same high standards for capital, governance, and operational resilience, the EU is building a non-negotiable, secure foundation for its digital single market. The rules ensure that if a fintech fails, it doesn't take down its banking partner or its users with it.
So it seems we agree that the operational bar has been raised to an unprecedented height, requiring substantial investment in stability measures, but we disagree profoundly on whether that height is beneficial to competition and market dynamism.
I think so. The integrated architecture highlights that no financial service exists in a vacuum. Understanding the true impact requires continuous analysis of how these overlapping regulations, PSD3, AMLR, MiCA, and DORA, converge in the daily operation of every financial entity, whether they are incumbents or challengers. The financial battlefield is now far more demanding, but hopefully also far more resilient.